Hey everybody, it's EJ from eyedesyn.com, and today I'm going to be going over motion streaks using Sketch and Toon in Cinema 4D. So in Sketch and Toon, if you go to your sketch style tags, if you don't know about sketch style tags, be sure to check out my tutorial all about them. But we have this motion line type right here. And when you go into the motion line settings, we have a bunch of options here. And I'm only going to be covering the ones that I think are the most useful for a line art style animation. So by default, you can choose the number of motion lines that you want to appear on your object or follow your object's direction. And we have two modes. The first is velocity, and this is based off of the speed of your object. So the faster your object's moving, the longer your motion streaks will be, and the slower it's going, the shorter your motion streaks will be. The mode that I'm going to use today, and the one that I like to use all the time, is trail. And now what the trail does is it works a lot like a tracer object. So MoGraph tracer object basically trails the animation path of your object. And you can basically adjust the scale or adjust the length of your trail based on the amount of frames that you set here. So the higher the frames in this field, the longer your trail. So typically, I only like to use very short trails. So you'll probably use something around 1 to 4 or 5. And then the one thing that sets this apart from the tracer object is the threshold amount here. Now, the threshold is what activates your motion lines. So once your object is moving a fast enough speed, that will activate the motion lines to start drawing on. So the higher this number, the faster your object needs to get to have motion lines applied to it. So if your threshold's very low, like 0 centimeters, your object doesn't have to move very fast at all for motion lines to start appearing. Conversely, if you have, say, a very large number in here, your object will have to pick up a lot of speed to then activate the threshold and then activate the drawing on of the line. So this is handy for if you have an object like we have here, where we have a letter spinning and rotating and turning into a laptop and then spinning again. Say you don't want motion lines to start until the speed of the rotation hits a certain speed. You can set that in the threshold and not have motion lines start, say, like right here. You want it to only pick up when there's a lot of motion happening. So that's what this threshold is all about. So you'll notice that I'm not really showing anything or rendering, and the reason for that is that unlike many of these line types, you can just hit render in your viewport and actually see these streaks or these outlines in your viewport and rendered on your objects. But the thing about motion lines is the only way you can see them is if you do a preview render or just render it out. So that's the unfortunate part about motion streaks. So the way I like to work is not by using having this be applied to the objects that you want. So I have this applied to this laptop object, but what I like to do to have a way more predictable motion streak is to actually just create objects that are just for the sole purpose of creating motion streaks. So what I'm going to do is create brand new objects. And the only thing you need to worry about is you need to make sure that the object that you're using actually has geometry. So motion streaks won't show up on objects without geometry, like a null. So what I like to use is spheres. So what I'm going to do is just drag these spheres underneath my group. So my group object is the thing that's actually rotating. So you can see that my sphere is now rotating. So that's all well and good. Now all I need to do is position these spheres where I want motion streaks to appear from and be drawn on from. So they'll trace the trails of this sphere. So you can see as the sphere moves, what we're going to be doing is actually tracing the movement of that sphere. The only problem we have right now is when I hit render, that sphere is going to show up in our render. And the way we can get rid of that in our render is to just simply go and place a compositing tag on this, and we're going to uncheck this scene by camera, raise, GI, all of this stuff. Get rid of all of it, and you'll see that that will remove it from. Come on, render. That will remove it from our render, but you actually still see that line there. So what we're going to do is apply a sketch style tag and make sure that there's no line types being drawn on that object we have there. So that's all well and good. So we have it hidden from render, and we also have it hidden from applying any outlines or anything to it. So we can position this sphere where we want our streaks to be. So I'm going to just duplicate this. So I'll have 2 streaks on this side, and then I'll duplicate it again and just have 1 streak appear on this side. So then what I'm going to do is on those sketch style tags on my spheres, I'm going to activate that motion line type. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to have each of these spheres just generate 1 line. So I'm going to change the number of lines generated from 20 to 1. And again, I'm going to use the trail mode. And then for each of these, I'm going to adjust the length of the motion trail to be a little bit shorter, so say about 3. And you can go into each of these individual spheres and change the sketch style tag motion trail to be different lengths. So now I have a trail that has 4 frames length, 3, and then 2, just so you have a little bit of variety to the length of your motion trails. So again, we can go and change the threshold. So again, the threshold will be very handy for when you have objects just picking up movement or just picking up acceleration. You only want motion lines to appear when it's going fast enough to look kind of believable. So that's why we're going to jack up this threshold. So we can bring it up to about 300. And what we're going to do is then I'm going to do the old switcheroo, the cooking show where I put this in the oven and pull out the one that's been sitting there for 45 minutes. I'm going to go into my picture viewer, and I've already done some pre-renders here. So this is what we'll get when we actually render this out. Now you'll see that the motion lines only activate when our laptop picks up enough speed, and we have generated some motion lines. But the one thing you will notice is our lines aren't smooth. They're rather chunky. And the reason for this is we need to go a little bit further in our sketch tag options to smooth these motion lines out. So to do this, we're going to jump into our material editor for our motion streaks, or our sketch material that's applied in our motion streaks here. So I'm using this material, and we're going to go into the distort field, and we have this curve stroke. Now it's very aptly named. What it's going to do is actually curve our strokes and smooth our strokes out. So then we're going to go to our mode here, and you'll notice that by default we have some noise applied, and we don't need any noise at all. We just want to curve our strokes. So we're going to turn off the noise mode to none. So we got rid of our noise, and we need to change the type from linear, which is what it was at, and we got that chunky kind of angular lines, and we're going to change it to a smoother line interpolation or stroke interpolation. So you can choose any one of these. I'm just going to choose B-spline for right now. And this step option is handy for when you want finer or smoother strokes. So the lower this number is, the smoother the stroke will be. But the more render time it's going to take to smooth out those lines. So just keep that in mind. I'm just going to keep that at the default 6. And then again, I'm going to do the switcheroo where I already rendered this out. And then let's go to our picture viewer. And this is where we have our lines smoothed out. So you can see that we now have smooth, curved lines, and that's due to our curve stroke being activated. And you can see the difference between let me pick a frame here that looks good. So frame 5, and let's go to frame 5 here. So you can see the difference there. We have chunky lines, and then we got smooth lines. So that's the way to get really nice motion lines that are nice and smooth and curved. So one added thing that is a really fun feature is the taper. And you already see I have some pre-renders already going. So let's go to the taper. And by default, it's deactivated. I'm just going to turn that on. Now, what the taper does is you may think that all the taper does is taper off the thickness of your stroke along the trail. And that's actually not what it does. I don't know quite why it's called taper, but what taper does is actually apply squash and stretch type movements to your motion trails. So basically what this does is apply more expressive movements, more cartoonish movements to your motion trail, and actually less follows the motion path of your animation. It more loosely follows it. So I'm going to show you exactly what I'm talking about here. So right now I have the strength and the X and Y. I'll just set both of them to 100%. That's as high as it can go. So you're going to see the difference between disabled, so this is without no taper, and then with taper enabled 100%. So you can see that our motion streaks are fairly long, and that's due to our taper, our squash and stretch. So this is frame 35. I'll just navigate to frame 35 on our taper disabled render, and you can see the difference that squash and stretch makes here. So you can see our lines are way more expressive and pretty cartoony. The one benefit of using the taper is, number one, since it's following less loosely the motion path, again, I said it's way more of an expressive kind of motion line. But number two, if I go to the very end of this animation where our streaks are just about to pop off the screen, so frame 38, let me go to frame 38 on this as well, you can see a little bit of the squash happening. So this streak right here is kind of squashing in. So it looks a little bit more natural, like your streaks are growing on and then the tail is kind of contracting in on itself. So it looks a little bit less abrupt when it pops off screen with the taper disabled as opposed to the where it's enabled. So you can see it's a little bit smaller and doesn't look like it's popping off totally. And here's a render where I kind of split the difference and had a strength of 50 in both X and Y. And you can see that just a little bit goes a long way. So we have just a little bit of squash and stretch, and it really adds some extra oomph and gives more expressive movements to that laptop and really accentuates the rotational movement of our objects here using the motion streaks. So you can see that even in this render, probably could do with getting that threshold a little bit higher, so we're not getting the streaks popping up when there's barely that much rotational movement. So that can all be taken care of by just bringing up the threshold value a little bit higher. So we can kind of get rid of those until and just get the motion streaks happen where we're really getting some fast rotational movements. But actually it looks okay in the middle, but we still have motion streaks when our laptop's kind of coming to an end. So I could have probably raised that up a little bit. But again, you know, you can keep adjusting this and doing RAM preview or preview renders. Don't RAM preview in here, but preview renders in the picture viewer. And again, it's the only downside about motion streaks is you have to do the pre-renders to actually see what it's going to look like. But sometimes the work is worth it because you do have the benefit of this taper, and you do have the benefit of that threshold value that you just would not have using a tracer and perhaps applying a hair material to that tracer to render out that spline, or doing a sweep NURB with like a circle spline. So those are your alternatives to doing motion streaks, but I find this a lot of fun using the Sketch and Toon motion line route. So if you have any questions, hopefully that all made sense. I'd really like to see if you guys do anything with this, and if you do, be sure to show me and share it on Twitter and all that good stuff. And yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Bye, guys.